So I'm one of the rare WCS people who's not a graduate of the University of Florida. I'm actually amazed that they let me in the door. But I'm really excited to be here today because this session really speaks very much to my heart, because it's a discussion about food and environment, probably two of my greatest passions in my own life. So anytime I have an opportunity to talk about food, I grab it. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the session here. It's great to see a lot of friends and colleagues. I am going to talk today about some of the work that WCS is doing at the intersection of conservation and food production. But I have to say that just given how close to my heart this theme is, what I'm going to offer today is really a very personal reflection on these issues. So I'm starting out with a rather provocative title, and hopefully it translates into the other languages of the non-primary English speakers, because there's kind of a joke metaphor in the Foodies and Greens title. So I think it's pretty safe to say that conservationists see industrial agriculture as basically the antithesis of conservation. We look at these enormous squares of denuded land, like here in the Amazon or maybe in the Atlantic forest, and we basically see the complete absence of nature. In fact, we know, and our previous speakers have pointed out, that agricultural production is the leading driver of tropical deforestation. We also know that the global population is increasing, as well as the demand for food that goes along with that. So Ave's talk and Miguel's talk, and indeed the framing of this conference so far, has really focused on deforestation and the deforestation impacts of agricultural production. But I think we actually care about a lot of the other impacts of this production system as well. We care about the overuse of pesticides and fertilizers, and the impact that that has on water quality and on soil fertility. We care about the loss of pollinator services. We care about the overuse of resources in the production of agriculture. So all those things really matter to us. And there are other aspects, more sort of sociocultural aspects of the dynamics of industrial food production that we also care about, like food sovereignty issues. We care not just about the total volume of production of food, but we care about its nutritional qualities and its health benefits. We care a lot about the resources expended in the transport of food across a global economy. And we care about the waste that's in the system, whether it's the waste from that transport or whether it's waste on the consumption end of the spectrum. I think we also care, and I particularly do as a social scientist, about the rights of people to have choices about the kind of food that they consume, and also the rights that people have to care about the types of production systems that exist in their countries and the quality of the food that as nations they produce and contribute to the world economy. I think it's also really important to remember that the world actually does produce enough food to feed the global population. I know we talk about these sort of billions of people that are being added to the world's population, but it's actually not true that we don't produce enough food to feed them. And interestingly enough, I must have been on the same airline as Ave was, because I also read the article that was in the Onboard magazine from the CEO of Cargill, David McLennan. And actually the reporter's question that caught my eye was the question, does the world actually need to produce more food? And the CEO of Cargill's answer was, there is enough food produced today to fill in the deficit. So I think it's very important that we bear that in mind. And importantly, I think that gives us some space to really talk about the other options that exist for the way that we produce food. But nevertheless, I would still say that most of the environmental movement's interactions with industrial agriculture do focus on deforestation. And it does seem to be true that at least currently, alternative food production systems, such as organic production, which is probably the most widespread alternative, can approach but don't come close right now to matching conventional agricultural production volume. And this has been studied extensively. For example, in the journal Nature, there were a series of metadata analyses that all came to the basic consensus that overall, organic farming yields about 75% of what conventional agriculture yields. So despite the problems that we know exist in the industrial agricultural system, most of us still accept the premise that industrial agriculture is the only way to support global population and its food needs. And we all, including I think most of us in this room, work really hard to make that system more sustainable and less impactful through a lot of the processes that Ave mentioned and whose logos are up on this screen. But there's a lot of consequences of the industrial agriculture system that I think we need to consider. And here I'm going to draw some data from the slow food movement. And basically, I don't know if people are familiar with slow food. I'll talk about it a little bit later on in my talk, but it's basically a recognition of the diversity and the history of agricultural production on this planet since the invention of agriculture in the Neolithic. According to Slow Food, more than 90% of crop varieties have disappeared from farmers' fields. And today, 60% of the world's food is based on just 3 cereals: wheat, rice, and corn. So the slow food people look at that, and what they focus on is really the loss of that cultural richness and the loss of the diversity of cuisines and the loss of sort of the gastronomic diversity of those kinds of systems. But we as environmentalists look at that loss and see an enormous loss of genetic diversity. And that brings with it, of course, huge environmental risks. So what I'm going to talk about today is a different kind of food production movement. And as it happens, I think that this movement is pretty rich. So in the States, we call it the foodie movement. You can call it the gastronomy revolution if you want to, but I'm going to use the term the foodie movement. And the foodie movement has a number of different offshoots. It's got its own taxonomy, very interesting. And I'm going to talk about 4 branches of the overall umbrella of the foodie movement today: locavorism, nose-to-tail eating, organic farming, and the search for more authentic foodways, which is basically Slow Food's mission. And I would say that these movements, or this umbrella movement of foodieism, I just made that up, is not just a trend. I actually think that this is a true movement. So for example, the Institute of Food Technology, who knew there was an Institute of Food Technology, reported in 2013 that 3/4 of US adults enjoy talking about new or interesting foods. I'm one of those people. 53% of US adults regularly watch cooking shows. Awesome. 2/3 of adults in the US purchase specialty foods for everyday home meals, and this market reached $75 billion in 2011, which is a good couple of years ago. I think that most conservationists Thank you. I'm glad you're laughing. It was meant to be funny. This is a funny story. This is actually a screenshot from a YouTube video that's called Getting Real in the Whole Foods Parking Lot. And it's a rap about tension that happens when people go into the Whole Foods and they're fighting over the fact that they can't find the kombucha. So, anyway, you should check it out. So despite those statistics that I offered you that I think really do demonstrate that the foodie movement is a true movement and that it is impactful in terms of its scale, I think most conservationists don't really think about this movement at all. Or if we think about it, this is what we think about. We think it's some sort of trendy thing that people do in Brooklyn or San Francisco, where they go to the market and they buy, the Humboldt Bog cheese and they grab their Pinot Noir and, they're driving up the cost of kale or quinoa. Or maybe quinoa. Or maybe to the extent that we do think about this movement, we see it only as having really severe negative consequences for local populations, as trends for things like acai or quinoa boom and then bust. And we fret about the appropriation of traditional foods by the global north. So here are 2 examples, and I'm just going to illustrate this point with acai and with quinoa. So acai became a popular superfood in the 2000s. And it brought with it high hopes of being the kind of non-timber forest product that could actually reach that holy grail balance of bringing economic benefits to local people, improving local livelihoods, while also conserving forests. So this was such a big trend that this was even promoted as a superfood by Oprah on her magazine and on her show. In 2008, according to Bloomberg News Service, US purchases of acai reached $104 million in value. So that's a big number. But it turned out that there were, of course, as a lot of people in this room know, very serious negative consequences of this boom. Acai was traditionally produced, it's a wild palm fruit. It was traditionally harvested from natural palm forests in the flooded forest areas of the Amazon. But because of the boom, a lot of those natural stands were replaced by intensive management of palm plantations. In addition, a market focus on export led to local scarcities of food. And this was particularly impactful on poor people, for whom acai is a staple food and very important, particularly in the lean food months of the year. And even when it was available domestically, high prices turned what was once a staple into a luxury good. I think a similar thing has happened with quinoa. It has gone from being considered some sort of lowly, and I'm using quotes, make sure you hear that, lowly indigenous food, comida para los indios, I've seen it referred to in the literature, to a global superfood in just a couple of years. In fact, I don't know if folks know this, but in 2013, the FAO designated that year the International Year of Quinoa. And Bolivia's president and Peru's first lady were the ambassadors for the International Year of Quinoa. In fact, Bolivia and Peru are the top producers of quinoa, but there's a very big difference in the way that they produce it. So Bolivia continues to follow a basically traditional production method. It is basically organic, takes place in the Altiplano, the semi-arid highlands of Bolivia, tends to be produced by small-scale farmers. Whereas in Peru, there are large agribusinesses behind the production of quinoa on the Pacific coast, using a lot of chemical inputs to produce 2 harvests a year. In Bolivia alone, quinoa production grew from 27,000 tons a year in 2006 to 95,000 tons per year in 2013. That's basically triple the production. Meanwhile, over on the Peru side, the value of those exports increased from $31 million in 2012 to $196 million last year. And the country of Peru is about to overtake Bolivia, much to Bolivia's chagrin, as the top exporter of quinoa. And demand has pushed up the price for the Peruvian quinoa, so the chemically produced intensive quinoa, by 50% in the last 2 years. So that's actually a mixed story, right? Because on the one hand, the export boom and the associated price increase really benefits farmers in those countries. For example, the Washington Post reported in 2013 that the quinoa harvest in Bolivia boosted family income from about $35 a month to $220 a month. So that's a significant increase. On the other hand, similar story to that with acai. There are a lot of reports that the high export price of quinoa has cut domestic consumption dramatically, leading again to concerns that quinoa has become a luxury good that's out of reach for many, particularly urban, poor populations in these countries. Another issue is an environmental issue about its production practices. Aside from the chemical practices I mentioned in Peru, even in Bolivia, land that normally, traditionally was grazing land for llamas, for example, is being turned over to quinoa production because of the boom, causing soil erosion and also loss of soil fertility because the llama manure was typically the input that fertilized the soil. And as the llama are removed from the lands, you're getting loss of soil fertility. There's also an issue in the quinoa production story about food sovereignty and control of traditional genetic resources. There has been an attempt by a lot of US researchers who work for seed banks and research facilities that want to improve upon varieties of quinoa to access the Bolivian races. And the Bolivian government has a policy that they don't share the genetic material from quinoa because it's their genetic intellectual property. And so there's this sort of tension over whether or not those strains can continue to be preserved. I do want to share just one final story on quinoa, which is that before I started researching this issue, I probably, like many of you in the room, had heard a lot of stories about land conflict and literally fights between different farmer groups over the production of quinoa. If folks have other information, I'd love to hear it, but I actually only found one report in the literature about a single incident that then got multiplied multiple times in the press and in social media. So I have friends in the US who have stopped eating quinoa because their impression is that it's causing a lot of social conflict, but I actually only found one case of that. So if people have other information on that, I would love to hear it. So returning to my question with this kind of background in mind, is the foodie movement destined to be a niche trend like acai, or to necessarily have negative consequences like we see in the quinoa story? What if the foodie movement had an explicit conservation goal and it could reach it at scale, what would that look like in terms of the questions that we as conservationists are interested? And even if the foodie movement could reach that scale, the other important question is, will it benefit local people in the tropics, or does it only benefit rich people in the global north? So this is a typical kind of foodie photo of a lovely dish of food from a fancy restaurant. And if you didn't know, you would probably think that it's a restaurant in New York or London or Copenhagen. But it's actually from La Paz, Bolivia. And I'll come back to that story in a couple of minutes. So I personally don't think that a foodie movement needs to be small. Organic, for example. Myra Goodman, who is the CEO of the largest organic farming collaborative in the United States, gave a talk last year at TEDx Manhattan's annual symposium on changing the way we eat. And she reported that there are $30 billion worth of organic sales of organic food in the US alone on only 1% of the farmland. So you can either look at that and say, oh, it's only 1%, so that's really an irrelevant trend for us. What I look at and say, well, $30 billion on just 1% of the land, look at the growth potential. And I think a food movement like locavorism, which is eating within a localized food shed, also does not necessarily have to be small. The USDA reports that there are 8,000 farmers markets in the United States alone, with annual sales of more than $1 billion. Local and regional sales from America's farmers totaled $6 billion in 2012. So again, those are still small numbers compared to total agricultural sales, which are something like $170 billion. But I don't think it's an insignificant number, and the point is that it's been growing dramatically. So there are a lot of reasons to take a look at the foodie movement, both from the environmental services and benefits that it provides, but also the sociocultural benefits that different types of agricultural practices and eating practices provide. So this is just a table that I put together looking at those 4 branches of the foodie movement that I mentioned. And you can read it for yourself, but I'll just highlight a couple of things. So locavorism, again, which tends to be defined as eating foods that come from within about a 100-mile food shed. The primary benefit for that is reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transport of food. But there are also cultural values, like getting to know your farmer, making sure that that farmer is actually receiving more of the money in the sales transaction. The benefits of organic farming, I think, are pretty well known to people in this room. The refusal to use chemical pesticides and fertilizers, so you don't have soil and water pollution. You also don't have human health pollution, I would say. But there are also other environmental benefits that really matter, like providing buffer zones on organic farms that provide habitat for wildlife. Organic farms are much friendlier to bird populations. There are a lot more beneficial insects on those farms, etc. Nose-to-tail eating might be a slightly less familiar concept to people. It generally refers to trying to eat all the parts of a given animal. It can sometimes also refer to eating all parts of a vegetable. So like the tops of carrots make really good pesto, in case anyone is interested. And here, obviously, the biggest environmental benefit is reduced waste. And I think that's particularly important given that animal production is the most intensive form of food production that we have today. But nose-to-tail eating also preserves more traditional foodways and local cuisines that traditionally have used those other parts of the animals that a lot of us who just eat, like chicken breast, don't eat. And then finally, the one that I mentioned before, the slow food movement, which is really the search to reconnect with more authentic foodways and to recognize that farmers are not just producing plant and animal varieties, they're producing culture. Right? They're key elements of cultural diversity, and they express what slow food calls the singular ecology of place. And we celebrate these kinds of traditional foodways through rituals, through the sharing of recipes, and through the kind of communal get-together that people do in all cultures around the world around food. So even if you accept that these arguments are interesting, it all still seems to be very focused on the US. Is any of this that I'm talking about really even relevant to the tropics? So what I'm going to do now is take a look at a few examples of sustainable tropical agriculture programs that have an explicit conservation objective. And we do have some examples, and I'm going to start with the ones that are not from the neotropics and then work my way back to Latin America. So this is the Ibis rice project. It's a project that WCS has been intimately involved with in Cambodia. The project provides local communities with an incentive to engage in conservation by offering farmers a premium price for their rice if they agree to abide by conservation agreements that are designed to protect particularly the rare waterbird species that live in these areas. Data from 2013 shows that 436,000 kilograms of rice was purchased by farmers, from farmers in 2013 for a revenue of $123,000. And in terms of conservation impact on the ground, that's about 130,000 hectares of sustainably harvested land. That's embedded in a matrix that includes about 630,000 hectares of protected area. So it's a significant mosaic of land. Another example, this time from Africa, Camacho is a sustainable agriculture program in Zambia, also developed by WCS, that produces organic and wildlife-friendly certified value-added products from commodities grown by and then purchased from farmers living in a high biodiversity area in Zambia who have become members of the Camacho producer group. The program has explicit conservation, has explicit goals both for poverty reduction and economic growth, and also for environment and wildlife conservation. Since the program began in 2003, over 650,000 hectares have been set aside as community conservation areas. Wildlife species numbers are stable or increasing in these areas. Over 61,000 small farmers are compliant with conservation practices. Over $1.2 million was returned to farmers through commodity purchases in 2014 alone. And household annual income has more than tripled. So I'm going to return now to that really yummy plate of food that I showed you from La Paz so that I can bring the conversation back to Latin America and wrap it up there. That plate of food came from this restaurant. This is Goose, founded by the co-founder of Noma in Copenhagen, which is possibly the world's most famous restaurant. And Goose itself is a restaurant that Food and Wine says might just be the best new restaurant in the world. The dish that I showed you was Cayman sashimi, purchased from the Takana indigenous group's Cayman Managers Association, Matusha Aida. The Takana manage a sustainable, certified, spectacled Cayman harvest program that WCS helps to support. And they sell both skins and meat. But up until now, the principal value-added product has been the skins. But last year, Goose bought 76 kilos of Cayman meat at $7 a kilo. And they're prepared to buy 1,000 kilos this year. So that's a 300% price premium over local markets and a significant income to the producers. So this roughly 60 members of this producers association can make up to $1,100 for 1 month of work in a year, which is about 3 times what they were able to make before accessing these high-end markets. So over the border in Peru, WCS supported a rapid artistic inventory in Bahuajasonene National Park to complement a rapid biological inventory that we did in 2012. We invited a group of 20 artists, musicians, and chefs to participate in a visit to the park. This project stems from a strategic and very lucky relationship that my colleague Alicia Carawiwa in WCS Peru has with Peru's chefs. And anyone who's been to Lima recently knows that chefs are rock stars in Lima. And they're major personalities, and they have considerable cultural influence. So the chefs who went on this artistic inventory created signature plates inspired by Bahuajasonene. And one of the chefs was Virgilio Martinez, who filmed a video about the potential of the natural resources that he found in Bahuajasonene for gastronomy, which he then went around the world and screened at really top-end food and wine festivals like the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. Virgilio isn't just any chef. He's the chef at Limas Central, which is ranked as one of the world's 50 best restaurants. And here you can see a snapshot of the dessert menu, which I'm pretty excited about. since I'm going to Peru tonight, which features some of the ingredients that the restaurant is now working with from the Amazon. So neither of the examples that I've shared with you today from Latin America are at any kind of critical mass, and I acknowledge that. But I think what they show is that the foodie movement is actually taking off in Latin America. And it's taking off at a time of important economic changes in the region. It's an emerging economic and political power with several middle-income countries, 2 members of the OECD, and active leadership in a lot of global political and environmental fora, like the recent climate change COP that was hosted in Lima. Latin America's economies are in general getting stronger. The region is in general getting wealthier. GDP growth soared after the financial crisis of 2008 on the back of commodity production. And even with the fall of oil prices and what I would say is the serious slowing of the commodity boom, GDP growth in the region is still positive. And I think it's really significant that the commodity boom has slowed, because I think that that really opens a very important window of opportunity for us to talk more seriously about these other types of production systems that are possible in the region. So the region is also urbanizing rapidly. Miguel, I think, pointed this out, but Latin America is the most urban region of the world, with 80% urban residents. And UN Habitat predicts that by 2050, 90% of Latin Americans will live in cities. So that's a huge trend. The Amazon is already majority urban, and major Latin American cities like Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Rio, Lima, Bogota are already world-class destinations. So actually another article that was in that same Onboard magazine featured Enrique Herrera, who is one of Mexico's top chefs, doing a walking tour of Mexico City and pointing out all of his favorite places to eat. So Ave mentioned sort of, mainstreaming. This is just a typical Onboard magazine. I think it's really true. Accompanying urbanization is the strong rise of the middle class, which is well on its way to encompassing more than half the population. And this middle class has great disposable income. And we all know that socializing while eating and drinking is a hallmark of Latin American culture. So I want to draw these various threads together and just leave you with 3 main takeaways and an important call to action. First, my personal view is that the zero deforestation calls that we all know about are missing really important elements, because we don't just care about keeping the trees standing. We care about healthy wildlife living in intact habitats. We care about the health of water and soils. We care about human health and the nutritional content of the food that we eat. And we care about the cultural values of the food that's feeding our growing global population. So we have to remember that the dialogue about climate mitigation and deforestation is not the only conversation that matters. And I think that we all have a responsibility to keep working to keep those other environmental and sociocultural values on the radar screen. Second, I think that the environmental movement has a tremendous opportunity to partner with the foodie movement and to work to influence that movement so that it more explicitly embraces sustainability as a goal. People who already care about locavorism already care about the greenhouse gas impact of food transportation. Nose-to-tail eaters already care about reducing waste. I think there is great benefit to joining forces between these 2 movements and finding common ground. Finally, Latin America's growing wealth, its expanding middle class, and urbanization mean that foodie trends that already characterize the US can gain critical mass in the region. We already know that places like Lima are world-class gastronomic destinations. So here's an opportunity to create in Latin America, from nearly its inception, a foodie movement that incorporates the values of both natural and cultural sustainability. And because it's taking root in a part of the world that is responsible for so much global agricultural commodity production, we have an opportunity to work so that people living in those countries can advocate for the notion of food sovereignty and choose to embrace and advocate for more sustainable systems of production on the agricultural lands that are in Lima's backyard and La Paz's backyard and Buenos Aires' backyard and the backyard of all of these great Latin American cities. Thank you very much.